No one in Willow Creek had expected the lake itself to become a weapon, but when the dam's gates groaned open under my hand that night, the neighborhood realized too late that the water they once claimed as theirs had chosen its rightful master. And the rush that followed was more than a flood, was justice, roaring and unstoppable. The hours before that moment had been a blur of plotting, betrayals, desperate countermoves by the HOA, and the kind of silent, suffocating tension that makes the air feel heavy. Because after banning the entire neighborhood from the lake in Section 5, they tried every dirty trick to claw it back. Hiring lawyers who circled me like vultures, staging community meetings filled with jeers and false accusations, even paying off a county inspector to declare my property unsafe. But I had already anticipated each strike and woven my own traps into place, securing title deeds, pulling financial strings, and aligning with powerful allies who despised the HOA's arrogance as much as I did. So when they petitioned the court for an injunction to strip my ownership, the judge threw it out with the bang of a gavel, citing not only the airtight legality of my purchase, but also the disturbing evidence of HOA intimidation tactics. Evidence I had quietly gathered through recorded conversations, hidden cameras, a disgruntled former board member who switched sides after realizing they'd scapegoated him. Victory should have tasted sweet, but instead it made them more dangerous, and within days, anonymous notes appeared on my porch, threatening me, my family, and even my dog, the kind of cowardice that proved they'd abandoned civility and were leaning into desperation, yet their fear only fueled me, because I had something they didn't control of the dam, a 100-year-old concrete giant at the far end of the lake that no one had thought about until I quietly assumed its maintenance. Contract as part of my ownership deal, giving me not just the water, but the power to command its flow. And while I never intended harm, the symbolic leverage was undeniable. One turn of a wheel, the water levels could drown private docks, ruin manicured lawns, and expose the fragility of their lakeside paradise. And so, when the HOA called a secret emergency meeting at President Margaret Delacroix's mansion, boasting of a final plan to crush me, I decided to attend not as a guest, but as a storm looming in silence. I slipped in through a side entrance, unseen, and listened from the shadows as they plotted to file fraudulent claims, spread rumors about me in the press, and even lobby state officials to nationalize the lake back into community control. Their arrogance dripping like poison, their laughter echoing in the chandelier-lit room. Why? And when I finally stepped forward into the light, silence crashed over them like a wave, every face stiffening in horror. Because they realized I wasn't just some stubborn fisherman anymore. I was the man who owned the one thing they couldn't control, and with steady words that cut through the air, I told them the truth, that the era of their reign was over, that their signatures, their rules, their false fines meant nothing in the face of what was real, and that if they continued to press, I would unleash both legal devastation and, if necessary, the wrath of the water itself, because the dam didn't care for paper or petty authority. It cared only for gravity and flow. Some of them scoffed, others paled, but Margaret, clutching her pearl necklace, sneered and called me a bluff, declaring that the community would never bow to one man. Yet the cracks in her voice betrayed her, and that's when I handed over a thick folder of documents, notarized proof of their fraud. The kind of evidence that would not only dissolve their HOA, but lead to criminal charges. And as they flipped through the pages, their faces drained of color, because it wasn't just words. It was recordings, emails, bank transfers, photographs, everything that could bury them in court and ruin their legacies. I told them they had 24 hours to disband peacefully or I'd make it public, and then I left them frozen in silence. Returning to the dam before dawn, where the mist hung low and the wheel groaned under my hand, and though I didn't release the flood fully, I opened the gates just enough to raise the lake levels by several feet, enough to submerge their docks, drown their lawn edges, and remind them that the lake was alive and beyond their grasp. And when the sun rose, the entire neighborhood awoke to the sight of water reclaiming their manicured perfection, the sound of it lapping at fences and creeping across flower beds, and with it came the realization that they weren't rulers, They were tenants on land and water that no longer bent to them. The chaos was beautiful, angry shouts echoing down streets, families rushing to save patio furniture, HOA board members frantically calling emergency services, only to be told it was legal water management under my authority, their rage clashing against the immovable wall of reality, and in that moment, I stood at the shore, casting my fishing line into the rising tide, calm as ever, while their empire cracked around them. But the war wasn't over, because Margaret, refusing to accept defeat, made her final desperate gamble contacting developers who promised to buy her influence in exchange for privatizing what was left of the neighborhood, or a deal that would bulldoze nature, destroy the lake's ecosystem, and erase everything that made Willow Creek beautiful, all for profit. And when I discovered her scheme, I knew this was no longer just a feud over fishing or property, it was a battle for the soul of the lake itself, and I swore I would protect it, not just for me, but for every generation to come, even if it meant tearing down everything she built, brick by brick, dock by dock, rule by rule. Because sometimes you don't just fight back, you become the storm, and the storm never asks permission. The day they thought they could reclaim the lake, I realized the final act of this saga had begun. It would be more theatrical than anyone could have imagined. That morning, a strange tension hung over Willow Creek Estates, thicker than the morning fog that rolled off Clearwater Lake, as neighbors whispered anxiously, peering over fences, checking emails, and organizing clandestine meetings, convinced that some loophole or miracle could restore their access to the waters they had once considered theirs by default. And I, standing on my private dock with a steaming cup of coffee, observed it all with quiet amusement, knowing that every move they planned had already been anticipated, every argument countered, every strategy foiled by meticulous preparation, legal documentation, and the subtle psychological advantage I had cultivated over months of careful domination. It was a surreal spectacle, a suburban drama of entitlement versus ingenuity. And as I watched Karen pacing with her clipboard like a general desperate to rally her troops, I realized that the climax of this story would be less about confrontation and more about the inevitable collapse of their own overconfidence. A collapse orchestrated not with force, but with patience, knowledge, and the unassailable power of law. Their first attempt came in the form of a coordinated, peaceful protest, with neighbors gathering at the edges of my property, waving banners, chanting slogans, and even arranging kayaks and paddleboards along the shore in a misguided display of collective will. But I had anticipated this exact scenario, notifying local authorities in advance, strategically positioning cameras to capture every action, and even creating subtle but effective signage that emphasized private ownership in ways both legal and psychologically impactful, turning their protests into a perfectly documented demonstration of futility, a visual testament to the fact that entitlement could be spectacularly humbled when confronted by strategy and preparation. As the hours passed, small factions of neighbors attempted covert approaches, slipping through gaps in fencing, hiding behind trees, or venturing onto my floating platforms with the hope that darkness and stealth could overcome legality. But every move was caught, every attempt recorded, and each failure only amplified the frustration and paranoia among their ranks, with whispers of betrayal, accusations of cowardice, and heated debates breaking out in the community, while I remained on my dock, casting a leisurely line, savoring the ironic theater of their unraveling, and occasionally waving or smiling politely, a subtle psychological flourish that emphasized both my calm authority and their impotence. By midday, Karen escalated further, involving local press and attempting to turn public opinion against me, hoping sensationalism could pressure a concession. But I had already prepared press statements, compiled evidence, and scheduled interviews, with county officials assuring that any narrative of tyranny would be quickly countered with indisputable facts and legal clarity, transforming their attempts at manipulation into yet another stage of my ongoing victory performance, where every overreach, every misstep, every misguided tactic served to highlight their misjudgment and my careful, deliberate preparation. Meanwhile, I continued enhancing my private domain. The floating gardens were now in full bloom, the pergola and dock adorned with elegant, subtle decorations, small fountains whispered along the shore, and every detail both aesthetic and symbolic, emphasizing the exclusivity and serenity that was now mine alone. While the frustrated neighbors could only watch from afar, imagining what joys and activities were occurring beyond their reach. Each forbidden view a psychological reinforcement of my dominance, and each ripple of water a silent reminder of the strategic triumph that had transformed a simple fishing dispute into a story of total control. The neighborhood's final attempts became increasingly desperate. Midnight reconnaissance missions, covert drone flights, and even a few audacious but ineffectual attempts to physically remove signage or approach the water. Each one meticulously recorded and cataloged as evidence of trespassing, further reinforcing my legal and psychological advantage. And as word of these attempts spread among the community, paranoia multiplied, alliances fractured, and Karen's leadership, once confident and commanding, crumbled under the weight of failure, exhaustion, and the undeniable truth that the lake was no longer theirs to manipulate or enjoy. Social media exploded with speculation, amateur videos, and gossip, portraying me as a mysterious, almost mythical figure, a fisher turned sovereign of water, strategist whose patience and cunning had reshaped the social and legal landscape of Willow Creek Estates. And while I stayed offline, I privately collected and cataloged these posts, each one a testament to the ripple effect of carefully executed strategy, the fascinating consequences of entitlement meeting ingenuity, and the broader story of how one determined individual could transform a suburban neighborhood through preparation, law, and calculated psychological influence. As the weeks stretched into months, the lake settled into its new order, serene, exclusive, and completely under my control, with occasional private visits from friends and family who marveled at the beauty, tranquility, and strategic mastery of the space. The neighborhood gradually accepted the new reality, whispering among themselves about the lake that belonged to no one but him, their frustration subsiding into awe, grudging respect, or, for some, silent resentment. And I recognized that the victory was complete, not through confrontation but through the quiet, relentless application of intelligence, patience, and legal precision. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped low, turning the water to molten gold and casting elongated shadows across the docks and gardens, I stood at the edge of the lake, rod in hand, watching ripples dance across the surface, reflecting on the journey from petty fine to complete dominion, and understood that this sog, sparked by a simple act of fishing and fueled by bureaucracy, entitlement, and arrogance, had evolved into a story of justice, cunning, and quiet power, a story that would be remembered, retold, and perhaps even envied for years to come. The HOA had been humbled, Karen defeated, and Willow Creek Estates would never again underestimate the quiet, determined individual who turned a lake, a trout, the minor fine into the ultimate triumph of strategy, patience, and unassailable authority, leaving me to enjoy my waters in serenity, knowing that the story of Clearwater Lake had become legendary. The moment Karen realized legal notices weren't enough, she decided to escalate to the most dramatic stunt I could have imagined, but even then, she underestimated me. One foggy morning, I awoke to find my driveway blocked by a convoy of HOA vehicles, golf carts adorned with hastily painted Save the Lake slogans, and an assorted cast of neighbors brandishing petitions, cameras, and the sort of self-righteous indignation that only years of entitlement can produce. And as I stepped onto my porch, cup of coffee in hand, I felt a thrill of anticipation, knowing that every action they took had been predicted, cataloged, and countered in advance. It was a meticulous chess match in which they were pawns dancing across a board whose rules they no longer controlled. Karen led the parade, waving a clipboard like a banner of war. Her scowl deepened by sleepless nights, and her minions echoed her chants, calling for a collective right to the lake, as if shouting could override the steel-clad legal reality that now governed the waters, and I watched with quiet amusement as they attempted to discuss, threaten, and negotiate their way into a lake they no longer had any claim to. All while I maintained the perfect calm of someone who had anticipated every gesture, every word, every bluff, and was now ready to savor the spectacle like a perfectly staged play. The confrontation began with Karen stepping forward, attempting to deliver what she called an ultimatum, waving papers and citing imaginary loopholes in my deeds. But I had already prepared a binder of documentation so exhaustive that it practically formed a legal fortress: historical land surveys, notarized affidavits, municipal water rights records, and even testimonies from county clerks who had personally verified the legitimacy of my ownership. Each page a silent slap to the face of their arrogance, and as I calmly laid the binder on the hood of my truck, the reactions were priceless: gasping, stammering, muttered accusations, and the occasional embarrassed cough from those who realized the magnitude of their miscalculation. Unwilling to accept defeat, Karen escalated further. She coordinated a group effort to stage what she called a peaceful lake protest, arriving with banners, folding chairs, and picnic baskets, positioning themselves along the shoreline, as if proximity could somehow negate the legal documentation, and I watched them flounder, shifting uncomfortably, attempting to maintain a facade of unity while debating whether to confront me directly or wait for some imagined loophole to save them, all the while unaware that I had already notified local authorities preemptively of any trespassing attempts, ensuring that their actions would be monitored and that any misstep could be immediately recorded for legal reinforcement, turning their demonstration into a theater of futility. Taking the performance a step further, I began strategic enhancements to my domain. Floating buoys marked off additional zones. Subtle landscaping altered sightlines to create private alcoves, and small ornamental bridges added a sense of scale and dominion, each improvement both aesthetic and symbolic, emphasizing my control over the water while reinforcing the impossibility of access for anyone else. And I could almost hear the frustrated murmurs as they realized that every inch of the lake they had once taken for granted now belonged exclusively to me, a transformation both dramatic and irreversible. Meanwhile, their attempts at subterfuge intensified. Drones hovered too close. Flashlights scanned the water at night, and whispered plans of secret fishing expeditions circulated through text chains, all of which I documented, cataloged, and prepared to respond to if necessary. And the psychological effect was palpable. Neighbors began suspecting one another. Small factions argued over the best course of action, and the HOA's once proud confidence dissolved into disorganized chaos. Each failed attempt reinforcing my status as the unassailable authority over Clearwater Lake. Social media exploded with speculation, amateur videos, and neighborhood gossip portraying me alternately as a tyrant, a genius, and a mysterious recluse. And while I remained offline, I kept a private collection of screenshots and recordings, noting the escalation of desperation, the subtle envy of some, and the outright panic of others. Each file a testament to the unintended consequences of overreach and entitlement, a digital chronicle of my quiet, unstoppable triumph over what had been the most self-assured neighborhood in the county. And yet I did not allow myself complacency. Knowing that history rewards vigilance, I began scheduling small events on my newly privatized Lake fishing tournament for friends. A sunrise meditation class, and even a small family picnic each, carefully visible to the frustrated neighbors. A deliberate reminder that the lake was thriving under my stewardship, the joy and recreation were mine to dictate, and that any challenge from the HOA or individual residents would be met with the perfect combination of legality, preparedness, and calm authority. Karen, increasingly frantic, attempted one last gambit. She sought to mobilize local press and influencers, hoping that public outrage could pressure me into concessions. But I had already anticipated this, drafting press releases and preparing legal counsel for every possible scenario, ensuring that any narrative of injustice they tried to fabricate would be countered swiftly and unequivocally, turning every attempt at social or public persuasion into yet another failed theatrical display of entitlement crushed by preparation and precision. Weeks stretched into months, and I continued to enhance my domain, adding subtle features: a floating dock with an elegant pergola, aquatic plants that created privacy pockets, and small decorative fountains that enhanced the aesthetics and emphasized exclusivity, each element a signal of my complete control. while the HOA members and neighbors resorted to ever more desperate tactics, from midnight reconnaissance to whispered rumors, all futile against the fortress of law, preparation, and psychological advantage I had created. And I could not help but savor the poetic justice of their frustration as I strolled along the lake's edge, casting my line, enjoying the serenity, and witnessing firsthand the slow, inevitable recognition of my unassailable authority. And as the sun dipped behind the trees one late afternoon, setting the lake ablaze in molten amber reflections, I realized that this battle had transformed not just the ownership of water, but the entire social order of Willow Creek Estates, where once petty rules and overconfidence dictated behavior, now strategy, preparation, and patience held sway, and the silent, calculated power of one person had proven capable of reshaping an entire community's perception, behavior, and access, leaving them to watch in stunned silence as my lake shimmered under my dominion, a testament to cunning, legal mastery, and the irresistible force of a will honed to perfection. By the time they realized I wasn't bluffing, the neighborhood had already begun plotting their own version of a silent revolt, but they were too late. The morning started innocuously enough, with the sun spilling gold across the water's surface and the mist curling like lazy serpents above the lake. But I could sense the tension radiating from the far side of Willow Creek Estates, where clusters of neighbors huddled near the edge of my property, whispering conspiratorial plans, waving cell phones, and gesturing as if the sheer act of discussing their outrage could somehow alter the immutable reality of my ownership. I watched from my veranda with binoculars, noting every detail, Karen pacing like a caged tiger, muttering about unjust laws while taking notes on a legal pad, her husband attempting to mediate with gestures of forced reason, and a small faction of younger residents filming short, incredulous videos for social media, each one tagging the HOA in a futile attempt to shame me, unaware that every post, every comment, and every tag was further cementing my legend as the silent, unstoppable force of lake ownership, a modern-day fable of cunning, patience, and legal mastery. Their plots ranged from the comically naive to the dangerously ambitious. Some thought of boating onto the lake in the dead of night, imagining that darkness and stealth could overcome legal reality. Others suggested petitions to the county, mass emails to the HOA board, or even direct confrontation, assuming that sheer numbers could intimidate me, when in fact I had already mapped their movements, anticipated their likely tactics, and created detailed countermeasures, including cameras, motion sensors, and recorded affidavits ready for submission if necessary. And I relished the irony of their desperation, watching them stumble from one futile idea to another as if caught in a labyrinth with no exit. As the days turned into weeks, I escalated my presence strategically, not aggressively, letting the lake speak for itself through subtle enhancements, floating platforms for meditation, ornate fishing docks, a small boathouse that could only be accessed by me, and decorative buoys marking the boundaries with engraved plaques, all visually asserting authority and subtly mocking the frustrated residents who hovered at the edges, peering anxiously like squirrels denied their favorite feeding spot. I even left a small rowboat tied securely to the dock, visible but untouchable, a taunting emblem of my dominance over the water. And I imagined the discussions inside each household, the whispered horror at the thought of being banned from their formerly shared lake, the simmering resentment, and the slow exing realization that legality and patience could dismantle entitlement faster than any angry confrontation. Karen, refusing to accept the obvious, began to escalate her tactics personally, showing up at my driveway with faux sweet gestures, envelopes of friendly negotiation, and even a bouquet of flowers meant to soften my resolve, all of which I received politely while secretly noting every interaction, filing photographs, and keeping meticulous records in case of future legal theatrics. Each encounter was a performance, a game of chess, in which she was moving pieces blindly, unaware that I had anticipated every gesture, every threat, and every potential loophole, and I savored the irony of her arrogance collapsing against the weight of my preparation, skill, and unyielding determination. The neighbors, emboldened by Karen's theatrics, attempted other forms of sabotage. Late-night fireworks to spook the fish, loud music aimed toward my docks, and even the occasional drone flown over the water to capture footage they hoped would prove my tyranny, each act meticulously documented by my security system, creating a portfolio so airtight that any attempt to challenge me would be laughably futile. And I considered turning it into a small showcase of absurdity, highlighting the ridiculous lengths to which entitlement could drive people when confronted with legal reality. Meanwhile, I began to explore ways to enhance my lake further, secretly installing a floating garden, adding a few fish species that were legal but difficult to catch, and creating quiet nooks along the shore for reflection and recreation. Each improvement a subtle message that the lake was no longer a mere body of water, but a personal dominion, a carefully curated paradise where only the rightful owner could partake. And the frustration of those outside the boundary made every enhancement feel like a strategic victory, reinforcing the lesson that patience, knowledge, and cunning could topple even the most self-assured neighborhood hierarchy. Social media began to reflect the chaos, with neighbors sharing photos of signs, complaining about the new owner, and speculating wildly about my motivations while I remained offline, observing the spectacle like a general surveying the battlefield from a high vantage point, amused and satisfied as their energy dissipated in fruitless anger and misguided attempts to reclaim a lake they never truly owned. The whispers, messages, and frustrated mutterings that reached me indirectly only deepened my sense of control. Like the quiet hum of a well-oiled machine executing a flawless plan, weeks turned into months, and I began issuing occasional legally justified reminder notices to reinforce the restrictions. Each one phrased with a polite formality that contrasted sharply with the growing panic among the HOA members and their neighbors, reminding them that trespassing was now not only unwelcome, but prosecutable. And each letter, meticulously drafted and notarized, amplified the psychological impact of my victory, transforming simple ownership into a statement of undeniable authority. And yet, the story didn't end with mere prevention. I introduced subtle temptations to amplify their frustration, a glimmer of the lake seen through trees, the reflection of docks just out of reach, occasional sounds of fishing lines being cast at dawn, all perfectly audible but visually tantalizing. From afar, heightening the sense of exclusion. And I watched as arguments erupted among them, with neighbors blaming each other, Karen demanding loyalty, and everyone slowly realizing that the very laws they had used to dominate were now tools of their own undoing, a poetic justice that thrilled me more than any legal victory ever could. Every interaction, every subtle enhancement, and every carefully planned deterrent transformed the lake into a theater of human psychology and strategic dominance. A place where the quiet, calculated patience of one person could completely destabilize a formerly self-assured community. And as I sat by the water's edge one late afternoon, watching the sun dip behind the distant trees, painting the lake in molten gold, I felt an exhilarating certainty that Willow Creek Estates would never forget the audacity, intelligence, and unwavering patience that had allowed one fisherman to turn an entire neighborhood into spectators of his triumph. It is a story that would ripple through their conversations, their meetings, and their social media posts for years, a living testament to the power of law, strategy, and the indomitable will of someone who refused to be bullied by petty rules or entitled neighbors. They thought my silence meant submission, but the first ripple of revolt was already spreading across Willow Creek Estates. When the first formal notice of the lake's ownership reached the HOA office, it landed on Karen's desk with the subtlety of a cannonball, and I imagined her sitting there, perfectly coiffed hair trembling as her eyes darted across the crisp letters, declaring that every single resident, without exception, was now prohibited from entering the lake or its surrounding banks. The legal language precise enough to make any lawyer nod in reluctant admiration while leaving the HOA's bureaucrats flailing, unsure whether to call the police, hire an attorney, or simply faint in unison. Word spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, fueled by shock, confusion, and the sheer audacity of a former neighbor now turned lake czar. Suddenly, Whispers became phone calls became confrontations, and confrontations became dramatic visits to my front yard, each one carefully orchestrated by me to observe their reactions, gauge their desperation, and savor the poetic justice of rule-obsessed homeowners scrambling to regain access they had taken for granted, all while I remained calm, smiling politely, nodding at their frantic questions, knowing that every move I had made was airtight, every clause unassailable, every loophole deliberately closed. They arrived in luxury SUVs, golf carts, and even bicycles, a parade of entitled fury marching to the wrong address. And I let them stew in their impotent outrage, taking notes in my leather-bound journal as if I were cataloging a fascinating sociological experiment, each comment, accusation, and futile threat adding fuel to my growing sense of triumph. Over the next few days, the HOA attempted everything from letters of protest to emergency meetings, but the combination of county deed registration, recorded surveys, and notarized affidavits made my claim absolute, leaving them wringing their hands and looking for scapegoats, none of whom existed beyond the neatly trimmed hedges of their own self-importance. Meanwhile, I began erecting subtle but unmistakable signage along the lakefront ornate. Iron-posted markers with bold lettering stating private property, no trespassing, and for dramatic effect, little illustrations of my fishing rod, with a smugly grinning trout leaping above it, a visual taunt to anyone considering defiance. And I watched from my porch as families slowed their cars, read the signs, and muttered incredulously under their breaths, their dreams of leisurely afternoons on the water evaporating like morning mist, a delicious, almost cinematic transformation of entitlement into helplessness that thrilled me more than any actual catch from the lake could ever provide. But I didn't stop there. Knowing the HOA's tendency for petty vindictiveness, I anticipated attempts at covert access, late-night sneaking, and desperate appeals to the local authorities, so I invested in security cameras, motion sensors, and discreet fencing, ensuring that any breach would be caught, documented, and handled according to the law. A perfect blend of legality and theatricality that made every HOA misstep into my personal entertainment. Each recorded intrusion, small victory, each whispered complaint a hymn to my cunning. And I even considered sharing some of the footage anonymously on neighborhood forums, just to plant seeds of paranoia, watching as the once self-assured residents began to doubt each other's loyalty, creating a subtle yet effective psychological ripple that extended my victory beyond mere ownership into the realm of social dominance. As the days passed, some neighbors tried diplomacy, sending passive-aggressive notes, small gifts with polite letters, or hosting peaceful lake discussions. On their lawns, all futile gestures against the concrete reality of my legal claim. I entertained them courteously, sipping tea while reviewing architectural plans for my future lake enhancements, imagining private docks, floating gardens, and serene meditation areas that no HOA drone could ever access, each improvement both an investment and a statement. And the knowledge that they could watch from their yards but never touch brought a quiet, satisfying glee. Karen escalated, of course, because drama was her default mode, calling in a swarm of lawyers, filing imaginary complaints with the county, and even attempting to mobilize the neighborhood association to contest my ownership. But I was always 3 steps ahead, affidavits countering any claim, deeds showing irrefutable registration, and a meticulous log of every prior notice, fine, and violation, which together formed an unbreakable chain of evidence that left their efforts looking petty, vindictive, and ultimately laughable a sort of legal slapstick that I relished in exquisite detail, noting every flinch, every exasperated sigh, every frantic phone call that ended in dead air because the county clerk simply verified the facts and moved on. By the end of the month, the lake was no longer a serene, natural feature quietly shared by the neighborhood. It had become my kingdom, with myself as both ruler and ceremonial guardian. And the HOA members, especially Karen, stood outside its invisible borders, plotting, fuming, negotiating, and failing. While I engaged in leisurely mornings, casting my line with smug satisfaction, imagining each ripple of water as a reminder of my victory, a subtle but ever-present symbol that power, intelligence, and persistence could topple even the most self-important community structures, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room, armed with nothing more than patience and knowledge of the law, could orchestrate a reversal so complete that it bordered on theatrical genius. In the evenings, I would sit by the water, watching the sunset glitter across the now private lake, hearing the distant murmur of frustrated neighbors and imagining the stories they would tell each other about my audacity, my precision, and my complete disregard for the petty rules they had imposed on me. And I realized that this was more than revenge, it was a transformation, a reshaping of the social order, a lesson in humility for anyone who had ever underestimated a quiet, determined individual with a grudge, a law degree's worth of paperwork, and a singular focus. And as the moon rose over Clearwater Lake, its reflection dancing across the gentle waves, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any fishing triumph, the knowledge that the lake was mine, my rules, my domain, and my story, a tale that would ripple through Willow Creek Estates for years to come. I never thought fishing could start a war, but, apparently, in my neighborhood, a trout was more dangerous than a loaded gun. That morning I had waded into the crystalline waters of Clearwater Lake, a hidden gem tucked behind the manicured lawns of Willow Creek Estates, and cast my line with the same serene ritual I had practiced for decades, imagining nothing more than the quiet tug of a bass or a glimmering rainbow trout breaking the surface. But by noon, my peaceful hobby had transformed into a bureaucratic nightmare. With a crisp, impersonal notice from the HOA taped to my front door, adorned with their infamous seal, declaring that I was in violation of Rule 4-B, no personal, aquatic exploitation without prior board approval. A clause so absurd it could have been plucked from a dystopian satire, and the fine, was an exorbitant $1,200 for the crime of daring to enjoy the lake that ran behind my property, some that could have fed a small village for a month, and that made me feel simultaneously furious, humiliated and motivated in ways that a mere anger management seminar could never achieve. I read the notice over and over, each word searing itself into my brain, like molten lead, imagining the smug faces of the HOA board members, particularly Karen, whose permanent scowl and polished nails seemed to mock my every move, and I felt an odd, almost primal instinct surge within me, an urge not merely to retaliate, but to reclaim what was rightfully mine, which upon reflection was more than just fishing. Right? It was ownership, autonomy, and the sheer joy of freedom itself. Over the following days, my obsession grew. I pored over every legal document, every county registry, and old maps that showed that the lake's jurisdiction was murkier than anyone realized. And the more I researched, the more a plan formed in my mind that was equal parts audacious and IT's. Legally bulletproof. If they wouldn't let me fish, I would own the lake outright. And with ownership came the ultimate leverage, the ability to banish the entire neighborhood from waters that, technically, should have been accessible to all. Property owners by rights of adjacency, yet they had arrogated to themselves under the guise of HOA authority. I began drafting a campaign, reaching out to land surveyors, real estate attorneys, and obscure county clerks whose names I didn't even know how to pronounce. Each conversation building a tapestry of legitimacy around what, to an outsider, might have seemed a petty grudge, but was, in reality, a meticulously orchestrated reclamation of justice. And in the evenings, I would sit by the window with a mug of steaming coffee, imagining the looks on their faces when the first legal documents arrived, the idea of turning the tables so thoroughly that they would not merely regret their arrogance, but comprehend, viscerally, the sheer audacity of their victim's response. I couldn't help but replay every petty slight, every overzealous rule enforcement, every snide comment about how lakes were common property that only the HOA had the wisdom to regulate, and each recollection added fuel to the fire of my resolve, until I realized that this was no longer just about a fine or a fishing rod. It had become a full-blown obsession, a story of cunning and vengeance. I could almost feel the lake itself murmuring in anticipation, as if the water had chosen sides, whispering promises of triumph and control to the one who dared to challenge the self-appointed overlords of Willow Creek Estates. I began to visualize the confrontation. A quiet storm of legality and strategy that would make the HOA's smug confidence crumble like the brittle autumn leaves under my feet. And I meticulously plotted every step. First, verify the historical records to establish my claim, then file the proper deeds, register the lake in my name, and finally, issue the formal notice that would ban the entire neighborhood, including Karen and her cadre of rule-obsessed minions, from accessing what had always been, technically, my property. My research uncovered fascinating details about property law and water rights, the kind of arcane knowledge that would make any layperson's eyes glaze over. But I devoured it with the intensity of a man possessed, charting easements, riparian rights, and municipal codes, each legal term a weapon in my growing arsenal of retribution. I even imagined holding a celebratory barbecue on my newly privatized lakefront, a quiet smirk playing on my lips as I watched their puzzled faces gather at the gates, barred from the waters they had so casually claimed as their own, and the irony was so delicious that I could almost taste it, mingling with the sweet scent of pine and the cool splash of water against my boots. By the third week, my preparations were complete. Deeds filed, attorney fees paid, and a robust legal framework built so solidly that even the most obstinate HOA lawyer would have to tiptoe around my claims. And with the final signature, I felt a surge of power, not the brute kind that shatters walls, but the subtle, unassailable force of legality that transformed me from a simple fisherman into the master of the lake. The water reflecting the afternoon sun, as if applauding my victory, before it had even been contested. Little did they know that the first notice would arrive on a Thursday morning, an unassuming envelope that would contain a bombshell. The lake, now officially mine, and the neighborhood, formerly entitled, now prohibited from setting foot on. My waters, their complaints nullified by the ironclad force of law. I could already envision the chaos, the disbelief, the calls to the HOA board that would go unanswered because the documents, so meticulously crafted, would render them powerless. And I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and exhilaration, knowing that my quiet, peaceful mornings by the lake were no longer merely a personal pleasure, they were a statement, a declaration that petty rules and overreaching authorities would never again dictate the enjoyment of my land. And as the sun set over Clearwater Lake that evening, casting fiery reflections across the water's surface, I stood at the shore, rod in hand, but no longer needing to fish, for I had caught something far greater: justice, autonomy, and a story that would ripple through Willow Creek Estates like the very waves lapping at my feet. Each crest a reminder that in the battle of rights versus arrogance, even the smallest fisherman could turn the tide.